今天再次邀请到 Stanley Hono Summits 的创办人来聊聊他管理多国文化团队的经验，特别是印度与日本。在这个单元，他也分享了如何克服沟通困难，还有如何引导团队也一起克服沟通障碍，有效的在国际市场竞争。Hello， 欢迎来到 Executive Plus 主管与沟通力的 Podcast。I'm Sherry, an educator, certified coach, and style enthusiast. 我相信专业有效的沟通是语言跟逻辑的完美结合。
And I'm Nick, a startup consultant, corporate trainer, and late-night gaming junkie. I believe great communication requires the right mindset and solid frameworks.
我们希望带给大家职场英语的技能、跨文化沟通技巧与其他能帮助您成为出色领导者的工具。
Join us each week as we share our experience, research, and methodologies to take your communication and language skills from good to great. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Executive Plus podcast. Today, we're bringing back a special guest. We did 2 great episodes based on topics around him. So in episode 220, we talked about radical candor. And in 224, we did our first round interview with Stanley, talking about his experience building a bridge between his US company and his Taiwanese company. And there were a few topics we felt got left on the table that we wanted to explore more, even opening up the cultural Pandora's box even more to see what else is going on with different cultures that he's worked with throughout his career.
这次非常开心又邀请到了 Stanley 能够跟我们聊一下他在这种 cross-cultural communication 的所有的非常宝贵的经验。那在今天的单元呢，我们特别想要来请 Stanley 跟我们分享一下他的经验在跟 Indians 跟 Japanese 做 communication 上面有什么样子他可以来提供给我们的一些 suggestions， 还有是什么我们应该注意的。Welcome Stanley, thank you so much.Thank
you, Sherry, and thank you, Nick. Hi, everyone. My name is Stanley. I grew up in Taiwan, and my family immigrated to Canada when I was 15. And I did my high school and college in Canada, and later on I moved to Silicon Valley, did my graduate school and start working, and has been here since 1998. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of Kono. Kono is a company I started back in 2010. It's based in Silicon Valley.And we have office in Taiwan and Japan. In this experience, I've been working with publishers and business partners based in the US, Taiwan, Japan, and some part of Europe. And in my previous experience working at Juniper Networks, I was running a team of about 70 people, 30 in Silicon Valley, mostly Indians and Asians and Americans, and the other 40 based in Bangalore, India.So
in our last conversation, I feel we had more time to explore what it was like growing your career in an American company. And even though you're a natural-born Taiwanese, you're culturally, and at least in a work environment, you're culturally American. So, shifting over and building that bridge between like your American work culture experience and then building back here in Taiwan and the clash between that. But you hinted towards talking about working specifically when you were in Juniper Networks with a lot of Indian colleagues. And then now as your other business is expanding in Japan, working with that. So we felt this would be a really good opportunity to dive back in there. So I would actually start going a bit more chronologically is when you were working at Juniper Networks and in Silicon Valley,There's actually, from what I understand, a very large Indian population. Almost any tech company you go into, you're bound to have colleagues that are multicultural, but especially a fair number of Indian colleagues. Was that something like going through high school or college that you had experienced and started building that cultural understand early then? Or is it when you got into the work environment, you kind of had to adjust yourself, or did you start learning at that point?
When I was in Canada in high school and in college, I do have interaction with Indian friends.But I feel that the interaction is always like friends and we always keep a distance. And I naturally spend more time with my Taiwanese or Chinese friends. But after starting to work at Juniper Networks, and by the way, one of the founders of Juniper Network, the CTO is from India. And naturally, as an engineer, I started as an individual contributor engineer. And naturally, most of my team were all Indians. Most of the resumes we got are Indians. And of course, the people we hire, of course, they are Indians. So after start working in the industry, I feel it's very different as compared to when I was a student studying and making friends with Indians. When you have to manage team and also you have to manage out when your boss and your team are all Indian, I think it's very different. It requires me to actually understand their culture to communicate with them more effectively.
So did you actually actively 就是非常的主动的去寻找，比如说了解他们的文化 Do you go through that?
Yes.
Do you simply observe or do you actually go and read books or like search for different movies or things like that?
Because when you start working, right, you have to, 你必须要就是 you have to communicate with them because you are giving them tasks or you are trying to tell them what to do. Right. And naturally, in order to make that communication easier, you have to understand their culture. For example, right, initially, I didn't know that there are many ways for them to shake their hand. Right? If you do it horizontally like this, it actually means yes instead of no. And from our culture, and when you are shaking your head, usually it means a no. Right. And I learned it when I was talking to one of my Indian coworkers. And when I was like telling him what to do, he kept shaking his head. And I thought I was asking him, is there anything you don't understand or what? And he said, yes. No, he said, no, I don't have any problem. And then still shaking his head. But I was so confused. And later on, I figured out that it's important to understand their culture. We are making a lot of assumptions on how people behave. If we don't know their culture, I think it's easy to make mistakes in communication, right? So what I later learned is that I think it's good to be curious about other people's culture. So I start going out lunch with them and hanging out with their families. And we talk about, for Indians, right? There are two things they are very interesting. Food, right? And the food is very different. There are a lot of meat they don't eat. A lot of them are vegetarians or they only eat chicken. So we talk a lot about food, dessert, and things like that. And at the same time, I was showing a lot of curiosity about their religion. Right? I'm not sure if you know, like Indians actually they have many gods. 他们有很多的神, and there's a lot of relationship between the gods. Right? There are three main gods, and then each one of them have their wife, and they have their son, and how they interact with each other. Just like 就像台湾的，我们从小会看一些什么宫廷剧啊或什么的，可是对印度人来说，就是他们那个电视上播的就是那些神之间的一些 story 啊，那些比如说有个很有名的那个 god 叫 Ganesh， 其实我有一个 coworker 就是叫名字叫 Ganesh， 他就是那个头是那个大象，然后身体是老鼠的那个神。It's actually very famous in India. And we also talk about the difference between Indians from the south and from the north. You know, a lot of Indians from the south are named after gods, and they all know each other. But I didn't know about it until actually I talked to them. And by building up a relationship with them, they feel more comfortable talking to you, treat you. The distance between you and them are much shorter, and they open up and much willing to talk to you.
我觉得非常有趣，因为刚刚讲到了一个很重要的 bonding， 也就是了解人家的宗教。因为老实说，对于印度人来讲，宗教是非常的重要。但是又很多人知道，我们在做 small talk 的时候不能讲宗教right? 我们好像这个界限到底要怎么样的拿捏会比较好？
其实我觉得，因为他们的宗教里面有很多的这些 story。Right? 其实对他们来说，宗教不只是就是像我们平常就是拜拜啊，或者是 religious。It's actually part of 生活都是在讲这些东西。像我刚刚说的，就是他们电视上看的那些，我们看的宫廷剧，其实他们电视上就在播 Ganesh 为什么头会是变成大象啊，怎么样的，他们都从小就看到大。Those are like stories for them. Right? 如果你 show interest about who they are, their relationship, a lot of the Indian I found out they are willing to talk to you about. Right? 甚至于就是 if you are curious about caste Couse 也是另外一个，就是印度有那个种姓的制度，那个也是一个蛮 sensitive 的 topic。可是如果你只是 show curious about OK what does it mean， 然后是怎么样的话，I think they are very willing to talk to you about。甚至于就是那时候我跟一个同事在讲，就是 OK， 她跟她老公是不同的 caste， 然后她的 family 会反对她，they actually open up talking to you about all those things。And I think naturally 就是 human 的那个自然的，其实如果你 show curiosity， 而不是说 OK criticize 说 OK 哪边不好啊，怎么会这么传统啊，或怎么样的话 ，I think they are willing to talk to you about everything.
I mean, it's really interesting to me that you frame it around this curiosity about culture, about religion, about people in general, because I feel that in the US, at least if you look at the news or we'll say woke culture, it's a bit taboo. They're like, well, you should just understand other people's cultural. Why would you just go ask them this very naive question and that might offend them? But a lot of times I find that when you encounter a new culture and you do come from a position of genuine curiosity, they're fine. They're like, yeah, I'll answer those questions because they probably thought a lot of American traditions, or people come to Taiwan might feel a lot of Taiwanese traditions are a little bit weird, and they just want to ask a question. It's not a criticism, it's not a judgment.
One thing about curious, I use the word curious, is that it has the proactive component in it. Be going out and ask instead of, okay, I'm interested in that, right? Curious means that you actually want to go out and ask more questions. And naturally, I think people will talk about it.
The other thing I really find interesting about what we were discussing connecting with your Indian colleagues is the conventional wisdom of small talk is don't talk about religion. But in this case, because that's so deeply tied to their culture, for them, that is just a daily conversation topic, or there's a lot of cultural pieces that if you want to understand, then you do end up asking about religion. And I just find that really interesting because anytime that you look for like, oh, what are good small talk topics or what shouldn't you talk about? Like religion's always number one. But in this case, you're like, no, that's a great opener to better understand them and to get them to open up about their lives.
And I love it that it's not about passing judgment, right? Oh, I think this is wrong. 我觉得那样子听起来好奇怪. It's not about that. It's about genuinely just be curious. 我很好奇. 这个是为什么是这样？那可以跟我讲一下他的故事吗？可以跟我分享吗？其实我真的觉得，如果 Stanley 刚这样讲，我觉得 it makes a lot of sense， 因为 religion 它就是人的一部分，很多文化的一部分。就像你刚刚所讲even like caste system 这些就是很真实的 it's a part of the culture 如果你要跟这个人更建立一个很深的一个 relationship 的话其实多去了解这种比较可能是所谓大家觉得比较 sensitive 的 topic 反而是一个蛮好的方式只是重点是你真的要把心胸打开而且是用很好奇的心态
Something I'd like to follow up on is that when it comes to building relationships with them or becoming close, that's one thing. But I would be curious when compared to your American colleagues or Taiwanese colleagues, how did Indians handle conflict or tension in the workplace?
Right. It's a good question. Indians actually, like most of Asians and like Chinese, they are also more indirect. Like from my experience, right, you have Indians and Americans in fact in this spectrum of directness, they are actually in the middle, right? Maybe for Taiwanese, people may think, okay, Americans are very direct. In fact, they are not when you compare to Europeans.
Yes.
Europeans is like, no means no, there's no other thing.
Yes, exactly.
Right? And then Indians actually on the indirect side. But at the same time, they differ from Taiwan is maybe because of their population or something else, they are much more aggressive in terms of asking for resource in the business setting. They are much willing. One example I give is that I always tell my Taiwanese coworker that this time of the year we are always doing the budgeting, resource planning, right? I'll ask my team how much resource you need in order to achieve next year. And for Taiwanese, usually台湾人通常都 very conservative， 他们都不会要求很多 right? 就是说 OK be safe， 因为如果我 set 越高的那个 goal 的话，我如果没有达到或怎么样的话，那 it's bad, right? For Indian, they are very different. They are still indirect, but they are much more aggressive. 就是我跟我台湾的 team， 他每次给我的就是比我想象中 resource 需要的还要少。那时候跟我感觉很不一样，就是我在美国的时候 manage 一个几乎都是印度人的 team 的时候，我每次比如说我只有100块钱的 budget， 每次都是300-400块，甚至于 right? Everyone is asking for a lot of resource. And when I was dealing with those Indian co-workers, I have to tell them, okay, you have to slow down. Are you really sure you can achieve this goal? You know, they are going to tell me, okay, I need to double my team or quadruple my teams, and I need so much resource, right? Compared to Taiwanese, usually they will say, okay, maybe I don't need extra headcount, I can manage this. Right, so that's very interesting. 就是印度人他们虽然就是they also indirect 哦，就是说他们跟你要求这些东西的时候，通常他们也不会非常直接的告诉你，可是 they are aggressive， 他们会说 OK， 我真的需要这些东西 in order to achieve that。可是他用的用法又不是非常直，所以 sometimes you have to keep asking questions. OK， 为什么你需要这个东西？然后为什么你是怎么去 allocate 这个 resource 啊？这些东西你才会知道说，哦，他是不是真的需要那么多 resource？所以他又不像是，比如说我可能美国人或者是欧洲人跟你讲说 ，OK， 我就是需要这么多，要不然我就没有办法做。他可能跟你讲说，哦 ，it would be good to have this， 可是其实他是真的要那个 resource， 所以他们讲话的方式还是属于比较 indirect。As compared to like Europeans and Americans. But at the same time, compared to Taiwanese, they are different in terms of they are much more aggressive on asking for resource, 或者是在跟你 communicate 的时候，他们也还是更 aggressive 一些，然后可是他们又不是非常的 straightforward 这样子。这是我跟他们一起工作的一个经验。那还有很可能也是因为那个 India 的 social hierarchy 就是非常 complicated。我们刚刚讲到种姓的制度啊，还有他们的整个 society 的 hierarchy 一直都是这样。
interesting。那我蛮好奇，就是因为我觉得很多的台湾人到国外之前，其实都蛮对这个部分，就是我到底要不要很 aggressive？ 因为其实我们都知道，很多其他国家的文化是非常的 aggressive 的。那我如果要竞争的话，我是不是要去调整我这个所谓的 aggressiveness？ 可是当你又不是很习惯这种方式的话，您有没有什么这种类似像这样的经验，就是可能有一个人台湾的人，然后你看到他好像在 struggle， 有这种 internal 的 struggle。
Maybe a better word 我刚刚想到就是 maybe it's self-advocate， right？ 就是愿意去跟别人告诉别人说我需要什么东西。那我自己的经验其实包括就是我2个女儿， right？ 我2个女儿都是在美国出生，受美国的教育，可是亚洲人 naturally 就是比较不会 self-advocate。所以我们在学校，他就是鼓励他们做很多 self-advocate， 有需要什么东西，或者是你觉得哪边不公平，或者是你需要出声 ，you have to self-advocate for yourself。其实 American culture 就是这样子嘛。今天如果你不 advocate for yourself, you're not going to get it, right？ 你 advocate for yourself, maybe you may not get it, but if you don't do it, you're not going to get it。那我觉得这样子的态度其实是还蛮好。那我也是 encourage 我自己跟台湾人工作很久的一些时间，那我也知道，就台湾人通常比较谦虚啊，然后比较就是觉得好像如果我需要什么，其实我的 manager 或怎么样可能会应该要知道的啊，这样子。And I would think if 你如果是在跟国外的 team 或者是一个外国的公司的话 ，you should not do that, right？ 你不是需要到我刚刚用的字用 aggressive， 或许应该就是 you need to be self-advocating for yourself, your need, what you, and then willing to communicate, right？ 那我觉得这些印度人也是。They do it in a more aggressive way. 可是其实你如果坐下来跟他谈，一个一个去分析的话 I think they are also willing to talk. And for Taiwanese, I think we should do the same. 因为我知道在这种 spectrum, there's no Taiwanese that is like aggressive or, you know, like too much of self-advocating. No. Right? 所以所有的 Taiwanese, I think I encourage everyone to self-advocate for yourself, like advocate for yourself, for whatever you need.Especially when working with Americans， 要不然他会 assume 你就是没有这个需求。应该 assume 你应该知道的 ，but no, they don't know about it, or they think you don't need it.
That's a really powerful lesson because I think a lot of people think the opposite of humility would be self-advocating. But it's really not. Like, self-advocating is not asking for more than you need. It's actually standing up for what you think is actually reasonable or possible. And so I've had a very similar experience in that we do a lot of startup coaching, whether it's through a program, and sometimes it's even free. And if there are teams that we work with in Taiwan, we'll be like, okay, go back, restructure your presentation, your pitch based on our advice. And I'm very happy to just give you feedback on your restructuring. 99% of Taiwanese will not come back. But then I've been coaching Indian and Japanese teams. And surprisingly with Japanese, when you make that offer, within the next day, they will have sent you things, they will look for feedback, and they will sign up for another coaching slot. And it's all like maybe covered by their program, but it's just like for Taiwanese, I'm not sure if it's, oh, I have too many free resources, but I also sometimes feel it's like maybe they feel bad, like, ooh, I took up too much of this person's time. But even in the case where I'm like, no, I really like you, I really like what you're doing, just come back. I'm willing to make time. A lot of them won't do that. Whereas other cultures will be like, oh, awesome, I'm going to take advantage of this.
我发现台湾人很常就是不好意思 right 可是其实 the other side they are already providing their time and resource and 如果 if you ask for more it's actually a signal telling them okay I like what you provide me and give me more 就是应该不要就是不好意思这样 because it's actually good from the other side it's also a positive signal okay I want more you are needed
Since kind of Nick already brought it up, what do you think? I mean, Japanese 在你来讲，我们刚刚所讲的这个 spectrum, you know, indirect, direct, aggressiveness, or self-advocating 这个 spectrum, 对你来讲，他们大概是在哪边？
Japanese 当然就是在 indirectness 到极致，至少我自己 interact 的人里面，他们算是最 indirect. And you know, I actually had a lot of miscommunication with Japanese. Right, for example, 就是我想可能其实大家都有听过，就是说 ，OK， 你跟他们要求一件事情的时候，他们说 OK，let me think about it。那常常之后就没有什么回应。In fact, it's actually a no。我需要我的 Japanese coworker 跟我翻译，就说 OK，it's actually a no。或者是 Sorry, I don't know, but in fact they do know. It's a no. Yeah， 所以 Japanese 就是在这 spectrum 里面是比较 indirect。At the same time 呢，就是说 This is how they do things, right? 其实对很多 Japanese 来讲，其实你也很难改变他工作的方式，因为他已经 fit 进去这个 society 了。I think there are a few things I would do, right? 就是说，第一个就是说 keep the conversation simple, right? 然后跟他讲说 OK, 我其实对你们 culture 不是这么了解。For example, 就是像每一次我去日本开会的时候，我永远搞不清楚我应该坐在什么位置。然后那个我知道就是大家知道那个就是你去跟人家 meeting 的时候，那个有什么主人的位就是主方的位置，或者是客人那边的位置，然后谁应该先坐啊，什么时候应该要换名片啊这些东西啊。So I think if you don't know about it, just tell them, right? 就是我通常就跟他们，如果刚开始我还搞不太清楚的时候，我就会很直接告诉他们，因为他们知道你是外人，而他们知道他们 culture 其实跟别人不太一样。其实就跟刚刚一样，就是主动的去告诉他们说 OK, I don't know about the culture, but I know this thing, right? 就是怎么做啊那些 Please teach me, right? 那当你秀出来这些东西的时候 they are usually open up, 因为他们也知道他们有他们自己的一些特别的 culture, 那别人也不太了解，或是告诉他们我们真的不知道，那如果我做错什么的话，就请你原谅我这样子。那 I think they are usually very open and they are okay with 他们叫该进嘛，就是外人这样，就是外国人这样子。So I think that is how I was trying to interact with Japanese. 然后另外 tip 我想可能很多人都知道，因为台湾人跟日本人 interact 蛮多的，就是跟他们出去喝酒啊吃饭。其实我不太喝酒，可是我就会跟他们，我们就是meeting 完之后就会去喝一杯啊那样子。然后通常在那边 Japanese will open up, right? And they are much willing to talk. And 有时候有一些人就是在 meeting 里面从头到尾都不讲话的人，你跟他喝了酒之后，他话变非常多，好像换一个人一样。They're totally different people, right? 所以 that's the other thing. 可是就是我记得我在日本有时候晚餐吃了3、4次这样，他们吃完这家换另一家去，到最后还要不要再来一碗拉面或者怎么样？我说我也吃不下。 Yeah, but that's how they actually do business in Japan. 然后，所以就是善用就是 meeting 完之后的时间 ，and usually I think you may get more out of it from a formal meeting.
Is that something that you learned quite quickly upon building your Japanese team, or this was like maybe the first trip looked like just a standard business trip, and then you kind of came back maybe not feeling satisfied, and the second time around you're like, okay, there's a different side or a different world? Or is that something that you prepared yourself going in? Like, okay, if I'm going to build a Japan team or a Japan branch, what do I need to think about?
That's a good question. I actually learned it over time. 我还记得我第一次到日本东京去那个 meeting 的时候，那时候是夏天。那我自己的既定印象是，日本人都比较传统啊，所以 meeting 就是 business 要穿西装那样。我那时候就是穿着就是厚的那种西装，长袖的那种西装，然后是夏天，然后I was taking subways, right? And I was walking on the street, and I was sweaty before the meeting. So usually there's like 7-Eleven or something. I just go there, buy a drink, cool me down, and then before I meet, right? 然后我记得第一次跟他们 meet 的时候，我就穿成那样子，然后结果看到他们，怎么都穿短袖的，然后也没有我想象中那种 formal。那原因是因为就是日本在十几年了，我不知道是什么时候，可是他们有规定那个 office 的 temperature 只能我忘记是比如说20，就是其实是属于偏高的，因为我要省电啊那些因为他们的 energy consumption is really high， 所以他们其实都已经有共识了，就是都穿短袖，他们就是有点像短袖的那种像西装那样，可是还是比较 casual， 没有就是用领带啊，就不见得所有人都用领带那样 ，it's much casualer than I thought。然后，所以 there's a lot of examples like this that I learned over time。我觉得就是在日本 build up 一个 team 啊，我不知道到现在是怎么样是对的还是对的。就是 I have tried hiring Japanese versus like 外籍 just foreigners in Japan. But I think there's pros and cons for that. If you hire Japanese， 就是像我之前现在的那个日本的一个 representative 就是日本人。When he is interacting with our client or business partners in Japan, because he being Japanese, he is expected to know a lot of rules because they think, okay, you are Japanese, right? 你应该知道，你应该告诉 Stanley 说 ，OK， 他要做哪里，怎么样去跟大家 interact. In a sense that it's actually good to have Japanese in your team, but at the same time, it's also they have high expectation.Because they are interacting with a team that have Japanese, right? Versus 我也有一个朋友，就是他在东京只 hire 外国人，不管是白人啊，或者是就是其他东方人啊，或怎么样 ，but all of them are foreigners. And when they are doing business in Japan, because they know you are not Japanese, right? All Japanese know, even if you are just half Japanese, they know about it, right? 然后所以 they know you are not Japanese. I think the expectation is actually lower.And sometimes it may be easier to do business with them because they treat you as foreigners. So they have lower expectation. And for some reason, Japanese actually, the other thing is, for Japanese, 他们看那个你是大公司还是小公司 they treat you differently. Like if you are working for Microsoft versus for Kono, I think they treat you differently. Even though you are all like American company， 他们对大公司、小公司是有一些成见的。然后，所以 for smaller company, I think it may be good to hire foreigners， 因为 they just treat they have the different perception for Silicon Valley like foreigner companies. They think it's actually good. 所以 it's interesting in terms of hiring， 然后就是他们会对你的 expectation 会有一些不一样这样子。
Would it be fair to say?As a pure foreigner company, you have a lot more leeway. But the moment you put a Japanese on the team, they're like, no, you should know now. Like that Japanese person almost becomes a cultural translator and ambassador that they must teach you the way.
Yeah, cultural ambassador, I think that is a really good word to describe it. And I think that is exactly that. So thinking that, okay, you hire Japanese, it may not be good for your company in this sense.
I never thought about that. That's the first time. Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective.
所以我们刚刚之前有讲到 Stanley 有讲到就是这种跨文化沟通的时候 make sure to be curious and also to keep it very simple. 如果有问题的话就是礼貌的问 OK， 那请问还有没有类似像这样子的 tips 能够提供给我们听众朋友的呢
就是跟其他文化沟通的时候，我通常是我有三字诀，就是第一个就是 C， 就是 be curious 嘛。那第二个呢，我叫它叫 open-minded，be open mind on what 就是 different culture。那第三个刚刚就是我说 keep it simple S，COS keep it simple 这样子。然后所以刚刚 miss 掉一个 point 就是be open-minded。那我觉得 open-minded 其实跟 curious 其实是相辅相成的。我觉得 curious 是比较主动性，那 open-minded 就像是我刚刚举的那个例子，就印度人摇头的那个例子，其实他是说 yes 的时候，就是当你看到一些奇怪的东西的时候 ，I think keep it open-minded， right？ 然后再用你的 curiosity 问他说，哎，你是这个意思吗？这样子，而不是直接就想说，哦，他是不是一直在否决我刚刚跟他说的话？那我觉得 open-minded 也是还蛮重要的一点，这样子。
I feel like when you're telling your stories connected to this open-mindedness, that even though probably there are certain cultural stereotypes or things that people say you should do this, when you personally, I hear your stories, are approaching new cultures, you approach them from a very clean slate, blank slate, where you just kind of let it go and just ask questions or go through experiences without a specific expectation or a stereotype in mind. It's almost just like a newborn walking into it and be like, show me things. Like I'm open to all these ideas.
Yeah, I learned a lot of those when I was in business school. Right. In my business school, I think, so my class was a class of 59 people. And I think about more than 30 countries were represented in that class. Right. And one example I still clearly remember is that so we are talking about untimeliness for like parties, for example. Right. 那时候我们就在讲说 ，OK， 如果是德国人啊或日本人，你今天问他说，哎，今天晚上会不会10点会不会来我们的 party 啊？他们说 yes 的话 ，like pretty much 99% they are going to show up if they say they are going to come, right？那如果是 on the other hand， 然后我们的那个西班牙或者是那个Brazilian 的 friend， 他们就说哦，他们说 yes 的话 ，I think it's about 30% or 50% they will show up 。那我记得有一次在我们的一个group project， 我记得我们的 team 有一个 Spanish，right？ 然后我记得我忘记可能是。我们就约下午1点钟，然后 we meet and we work on our project。结果其中这个 classmate 是西班牙人呢，本来约1点钟，他4点才 show up，right？ 然后我就说，你是忘记了吗？他不是 ，I'm just running late，right？ 那可是日本人跟我早就已经坐在那边了。So I learned it through all those experience, and 就是我刚开始没有，当然刚开始会生气，因为等他省3个多小时了，可是之后我发现说，其实他们的 culture 就是这个样子。I mean, instead of fighting with them, because they 日本人就是这样子，西班牙人就是这样子。I think you want to know, okay, this is how they do things. So I think that is the open-mindedness, right? It's hard to quote unquote fix other people because that's how they grow up. 因为他们之间 interaction 就是这样子。那 instead of changing them, I think it's much more important to try to understand them. And if you understand them, maybe, 如果我知道西班牙人会这样，至少我可能会打电话去问说，你是不是快来啊，快到了，或怎么样？那我就知道 what to expect， right？ 不会就在那边干等其他人都开始在做了3个小时，他才出现的这样子。
You have a better chance of making your own adjustments. Like, I need our team to be here by 2. I'll tell him it's at noon.
yes, that's a good way to solve the problem.
Yeah, or like just do like a 30 minutes update. Every 30 minutes, just keep calling.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you have any suggestions for our Taiwanese listeners or Asian listeners that are prepping to go to work abroad or working with international company, aside from just being open-minded and be curious about other people's culture and be more simple? Is there anything else you would advise them?
I think the other thing I sort of miss here, and we just talked about it, is be able to self-advocate. Right? I think this is applicable to all the Taiwanese because from my experience, we tend to be more quiet and kind of like sometimes assuming other people, my boss will know my need. Or if I work too hard, my boss is going to tell me to take it easy. Right? So I think we should self-advocate. And I think it's actually for good, right? And any kind of communication is actually good as long as you are open to like discussing and negotiating. I think that is important. I think self-advocate is the other advice I'll give to all the Taiwanese audience or Asian audience.
Well, I feel like we could continue this conversation for hours and definitely learn something new every 10 minutes. But we don't want to take too much of your time. I think in the future, if people are interested in learning more, we can definitely set up, if you're open for a round 3, there's especially this self-advocating topic.
Yeah, I love that.
Love to jump into. Is there any last piece of advice or anything that you would like to share with our viewers where they can understand more or get to know more about what you do?
The other thing I just remember is we would talk about radical candor. And I think it's a culture thing. If you set the culture across your company, like whether you have a Japanese office or Taiwanese office or US office or European office, if you communicate with your team or your business partner that you are practicing this radical candor, I think that will make the communication much easier across multiple cultures. Because that is more like a ground rule, right? If I tell for example, I told my Japanese coworker that we are practicing this radical candor. So he feels much more comfortable when I was telling him that, okay, you are not doing this right. Because he knows this is our like rule for communicating, at least in Kono, right? So he won't feel offended. So I think it's important to set up your cultural baseline so that when you're communicating with, at least within your company, to different teams or your close business partner, right, tell them this is how you actually communicate. And then it will be much easier and you will make much less mistakes when communicating across different cultures.
也就是让大家一个基本的沟通的认知。那不管他们对方是什么样的文化，至少大家知道说 OK radical candor 这个是我们公司的一种沟通的方式。
是，那样子我觉得就会减少很多的一些擦枪走火的情况发生。
对，所以也非常高兴，真的很开心 Stanley 可以跟我们分享这么多，我觉得也是一边跟您谈话一边有去学习到非常多东西。那如果大家想要多了解 Kono Summit， 也就是一个非常非常好的 app， 其实我真的常常在用这个 app， 我常常想要了解比如说不同的什么样 topic 的书啊，最近我蛮喜欢财经真的是最近很夯的一个主题，然后你们在 Kono Summit 其中就有一个 category 就是在财经部分，然后每一本财经的书又有一点点不一样，跟这种什么 personal finance 啊，然后怎么样 invest 其实都有点不一样。那我觉得我通常把这个 app 当做成一个就是我的一个 research app， 就是我要决定我要不要买这本书之前，我就来看听听，或者是有时候我直接用读的都可以，而且还有中英文这样的翻译，所以我觉得非常好用。那我们也有个 coupon code 提供给大家，所以 if you guys want more information, it's all in our show notes.
We want to thank Stanley again so much for joining us. And if you have any other questions, definitely check out the show notes. If you really like what Stanley has shared with us and would like to hear more, let us know on social media and we'll definitely try and grab another hour of his time so that he can share his wisdom. But we thank you guys so much for joining our interview and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
The Executive Plus podcast is a Presentality Group production, produced and hosted by Sherry Fang and Nick Howard. You can search us on Facebook, 主管英文 Executive Plus. You can also find us on Instagram, Communication R&D, and email us at sherry@epstyleplus.com.